A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So 1000 Shabbos at the Gitzah.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geber.
Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is dedicated by Yechiel and Chana Rivki Weinberger, Leili Nishmas, Reb Shlomo, and Chaya Sarah Brown. Reb Shlomo was a Talmud of the Shevet Sofer in the Pressburger Yeshiva, and his wife, Chaya Sarah, was a daughter of the noted philanthropist and Baal Chesed Reb Yaakov Elephant. Reb Shlomo survived Auschwitz with many great Hasidim, and the Elephant family survived in its entirety and spent months hiding in the forest of the Banska Bystrica area of Slovakia. With a passion for keeping to the minhagim and teachings of the Chasam Sofer, they established a family of many dairis of Bnei Torah. Notably, the Elephant family has taken a prominent role of leadership and chinuch both in Eretz Yisrael and the United States. So we're going to continue with this series that I'm very excited about, already from part 1, about the Chasam Sofer. Rav Moshe Sofer, Rav Moshe Schreiber, originally of Frankfurt, the Mainz, in Germany, and most noted for his long rabbinical career in Pressburg, today Bratislava in Slovakia, and his influence in leadership in the areas of Hungary, confronting the challenges of modernity, and the yeshiva that he established, and the incredible amount of writing which was later published posthumously over the years till today, still published, and in many, many areas he's been very influential. And I already had one episode about the Chasam Sofer a few months ago, which I'll put a link to into the notes for this episode, and I hope to have many more. Chasam Sofer is almost like a bottomless pit, and in part 1, we mostly discussed brief overview and his family and his legacy through his family, generations of Jewish leadership following his passing. And now I want to get back a little bit to he himself and the leadership that he exhibited during the 19th century, which was a century of change, and especially he was one of the ones who's noted for confronting those challenges of modernity and standing for tradition. So I definitely would like to continue this series, and we're hoping to get more sponsorships for future episodes of Chasam Sofer. I'm going to discuss different aspects of his leadership and legacy and his yeshiva and different stage periods of his life, his youth, his early rabbinical positions. What was it like within the city of Pressburg? What was his yeshiva like? What was his world stage position? What were his writings about? What were his students like? The diversity among his students, his legacy, which is always a big dispute. What exactly is his legacy? So there's going to be quite a few episodes, and you can be in touch with me regarding these sponsorships at yehuda@yehudageber.com. That's the email that you can send it to me if you'd like to have another episode about the Chasam Sofer. Here in part 2, I want to go further into an overview and discuss some of the complexities of perhaps some of those cliche or famous things about the Chasam Sofer, such as his famous saying, Chadash Asur Min Hatorah, that anything new is forbidden. What exactly did he mean by that? And I want to use a few aspects of that to clarify, because very often we look at the Chasam Sofer as somewhat this black and white idea or personality or legacy, when in reality there's lots of shades of gray and there's complexity and nuance there, which is what I want to delve into by looking at the Chasam Sofer within his historical context. So I think this will be a good springboard for both the current episode and for some future ones as well. And I thought that this episode is especially apropos, as initially when I was preparing it, I noticed that the Chasam Sofer was born, it said, in the month of Tishrei. And then I took another look, and it seems that it was actually today. Today, the 7th day of Tishrei, is his birthday, so happy birthday, Chasam Sofer, and it's his 260th birthday, I believe, 1762, 90, so it would seem. Yeah, his 260th birthday, so it's very appropriate to continue his story today. Before I get back into the Chasam Sofer, I noticed in the news today the passing of Rabbi Eliezer Kugel at the ripe old age of 99, a very, very special man, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Shvut Ami Kiruv Yeshiva, outreach for immigrants in Israel from the former Soviet Union. He actually established it in the 80s when it was still the Soviet Union. A very pioneering institution. Rabbi Eliezer Kugel was born in Tel Aviv. He studied at the Lomji Yeshiva in Petach Tikva. And he eventually was likely the first person to spearhead an outreach organization altogether in Israel when he went out to the development towns in the early 60s. This is prior to the Six-Day War, which is the accepted commencement of the Kiruv movement in Israel. So he did it before that. And he founded the Moriah Torah Journal. He founded the Technology and Halacha Institute. He was a very, very accomplished individual, and all without fanfare, a very special man. He was most renowned for it. He and his son founded the Shvut Ami Yeshiva for immigrants from the Soviet Union and later the former Soviet Union in the 80s. Like I said, I became familiar with it myself because one of my rabbis is Rav Moshe Sofer, may he live and be well, Rabbi Elyashiv's son, who I'm very close with, and he, for decades, would hang out in the Shvut Ami Yeshiva. So, Rabbi Eliezer Kugel, in fact, was his first cousin of the Elyashivs. Rabbi Elyashiv was his uncle. So I'd visit him there. So I met alumni of Shvut Ami and the way they spoke about the place and about Rabbi Eliezer Kugel. Very special place. And he was a visionary ahead of his time, and may his memory be a blessing. So that's just a short tribute. So now let's get back to the Chasam Sofer. Like I said, I think in part one, the list of sources that there is for the Chasam Sofer is almost unmatched about anyone else in recent Jewish history. There's been an enormous amount of material written about him of all sorts in all languages, and biographies and historical works, scholarly works, and enormous amount. I obviously haven't read close to half, close to a quarter, close to anything of what is out there. So there's definitely more to read. I specifically, I think I mentioned this by the Night of Yehuda and by other episodes, I happen to have an affinity for the scholarly works of Ma'oz Kahana, which I believe is only available in Hebrew, although I may be mistaken. So I use his as my main source. His book, Mehanayt Yehuda Ada Chasam Sofer, and also his article in Haggadolim, and there's other books as well that I use, and there's definitely much more out there. There's also many podcasts and lectures. There's a whole long series of Professor Mark Shapiro has about the Chasam Sofer and others. So there's an enormous amount of material out there, and people who are curious about him should definitely pursue it further. So what I'm going to focus on in this series is his biography, his life itself, his leadership, and I got a feel for the times. So we go to his gravesite in his gravesite in Bratislava today, and there's a surge in popularity and increasing visits to his kever, and the reason is because it used to be that people went to his kever because of its proximity to Vienna. So it was simply convenient to go if you flew to Vienna, so it's a half hour away. But now there's another reason. The increase of traffic is due to the fact that it works out there on an itinerary to go from the Chasam Sofer to Reb Shaila of Karastir in Hungary. It's like a good maslul, it's a good route to go. So it's very convenient to start by Chasam Sofer and end by Reb Shaila. It's kind of an Oberland to Unterland Hungarian journey. And if we would delve more into the symbolism of such a journey of going from the Chasam Sofer to Reb Shaila, what that means in the sociological context of today, that would be a fascinating study in itself, but I'm not going to get into that. So he encompasses so much. There's also another thing, his literary output, which really deserves its own story. He was a prolific writer. He also wrote beautifully. And he was an innovative thinker, and he wrote on the full gamut of Torah literature. He wrote halacha. He was a tremendous paisik. He wrote many volumes of Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, but he also wrote on Shulchan Aruch itself. He wrote on Chumash. He wrote on Drushes. He wrote on Shas. He wrote on many, many more, and quite a few. Until today, they keep on publishing. In fact, he didn't publish anything in his own lifetime. Everything was published following his passing. So there's various angles which are covered by it. As his customs, they publish books of his customs as well. And I think that there's a very compelling story that I can mention. It just happened with me a couple of weeks ago, which introduces the complexity of the topic and how his legacy is very misunderstood and maybe even misappropriated and everyone has an agenda and everyone tries to use it. The Chasam Sofer has become essentially a symbol for so much in today's contemporary traditional society. So I was by a neighbor in my neighborhood, friends. We were Friday night dinner a few weeks ago. We're two families together enjoying ourselves and good food. So it is a Hungarian atmosphere. And one of the topics of conversation that came up was the topic, it's a hot topic in Israel, and I don't want to get into it, it's the wrong platform for that, about general studies. Should they be introduced into the elementary schools or not? And I'm definitely not going to get into it or state an opinion on it. It's not the platform for it. And if you want to hear more about it, you could have joined that Shabbos Suda, or just come to me for a Friday night dinner when, recorders are off and it's more of that atmosphere that we can, talk about that easily. But either way, he raises the topic, this neighbor of mine, and he interjects with it. He says, anytime we talk about general studies being introduced into the Chadarim, into the holy Chadarim, so what I think of is the Chasam Sofer and his combating the neolog influence in Hungary, the secularist influence or the non-traditional or non-orthodox influences on traditional Jewish life, and how the Chasam Sofer was a fierce combatant against these trends. And therefore I see the historical parallel when it comes to talking about introducing general studies into the Cheder. So I dropped my fork and whatever I was eating, and I said, what you just said was historically completely irrelevant. He wanted to throw me out of his house. And the reason is obvious. First of all, the neologues were not a movement in the Chasam Sofer's lifetime. He's probably meant the Chasam Sofer's students who combated the neologues, which is definitely true. Chasam Sofer, his fight was, his confrontation was against pre-neologues. It was reformist elements. It was the different threats to traditional Jewish life, which we'll get into obviously as we go along. But it definitely wasn't against the neolog movement, because it didn't really exist in the Chasam Sofer's lifetime. It was more his students who went ahead with that. That's number one. But that's a basic historical error. That's no reason for me to get excited. But what I got excited about was the in a more fundamental sense, I said to him that these were non-traditionalist elements who were clearly declaring and stating openly that the Shulchan Aruch, the basic idea of observing Torah and mitzvahs as had been understood for centuries within the framework of halacha and the Shulchan Aruch as had been understood by traditional Jewish society, was no longer to be the barometer, no longer to be the arbiter of Jewish law, no longer to be the final say. In other words, it was more of a fundamental thing, right? They were coming along to say that we need a structural change about how we view Jewish law, about that it doesn't have to be the Shulchan Aruch, it could be something else. And therefore, we can have a certain flexibility within halacha. We can change things much more drastically. And even if things were not changed drastically initially, because it was a very gradual process, but the idea, the kernel, was already laid right in the beginning, that the Shulchan Aruch is not the basis of Jewish law anymore. And then Eologues later on, 30 years later, at the 1868 conference, actually said so, explicitly. And it was voted down. It was actually a formal vote that the Shulchan Aruch is no longer to be seen as the final arbiter of Jewish law. So how can that even be compared to a different discussion on, whether you're pro or anti is irrelevant, of general studies in a cheder? It has nothing to do with whether the Shulchan Aruch is going to be the rule of traditional Jewish society. It has to do with whether you're going to add general studies. As it happens, just for the historical record, the Chasam Sofer was not fundamentally against general studies. He happened to allow it in a school that he supervised in Pressburg himself. So which we'll get to also in the 1820s. A school like that was opened and it had general studies and he supervised and he was totally okay with it. He himself studied it in Mainz in his youth. He hired private tutors for his own children to have it as well. So the idea of general studies definitely wasn't foreign to the Chasam Sofer, the sciences, languages, stuff like that. So but that's not my point. I'm not trying to push an agenda here at all. I'm just trying to fix the historical record. So what I'm saying is, what I'm trying to get to is that he became a symbol. It was easy for someone to go ahead and say, and I have no issue with him saying it, that the Chasam Sofer is this symbol of anything new, any changes. The Chasam Sofer is the clarion call, is the one who we invoke as, no, this is what the Chasam Sofer warned about. This is what he fought against. We have to continue his legacy. And I think symbols are important. I think that's important to use the Chasam Sofer as I think they have a lot of meaning, and it's a good connection to have. And what's the curiosity here in a historical sense is, how did that come to be? What were the specific circumstances that he evolved into this crusader for tradition, this crusader for orthodoxy, this crusader for anti-modernity? How has that been interpreted by various communities over the years until he became and emerged as the ultimate symbol? And that's what I would like to explore, not only in this episode today, but in the entire series on the Chasam Sofer. And we can start with the slogan that's most associated with him. It's not just attributed to him because he actually said it. It's most associated with him is Chadash Asur Min Hatorah. Anything new, any novelty is forbidden. Forbidden min Hatorah, right? The Torah forbids it itself. It's not some sort of rabbinical legislation. This is the Torah itself. Anything that's new. So first of all, how did it come about? I want to examine it in context. We know exactly when it came about. It was Friday afternoon on the 18th day of the month of Sivan in 1819 that's when he formulated it. So he explicitly writes in this tshuva, in this halachic responsa that he's writing, that he formulates it there, and he uses it quite often. Afterwards, a few years later, he writes in another letter that this has become that he loves this saying, that he made up, that he formulated, and he uses it often. He calls it margala bepume. I'm very used to saying this. This is a common expression of mine. And what was that initial context that he used it? He had a student of his, and many of his rabbinical response, his halachic response, and Chuvas Chasam Sofer, is from students of his. One of the great accomplishments of the Chasam Sofer was his yeshiva, which was the largest and most impressive yeshiva in all of the area of Central Europe, and Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, and those areas. Eventually, hundreds of students, more grew even larger by his son, the Chasam Sofer, but he built up, he was this architect of the yeshiva, and the style of learning, he encouraged his students to enter the rabbinate, to get smicha, to get the rabbinical ordination, and to enter the rabbinate. So pretty soon there was tens and later hundreds of communities across the Austro-Hungarian Empire who the rabbi, the rabbinical leadership, was students of the Chasam Sofer, or later on of the Pressburg legacy of the Chasam Sofer, the Shevet Sofer. And this was like this empire that he created, and he already realized these impressive results in his own lifetime, and that is testified by the Chuvas Chasam Sofer, where a nice chunk, like a quarter or a third of the Chuvas, especially from the later years, are between him and students of his who were rabbis in many different towns and cities across the empire. So he sees the fruits of his labor. He sees the positive results of his own efforts to teach and inculcate those students and send them out into the trenches. And this particular tshuva was written to a student of his. This student had witnessed a local custom, whatever it was, which maintained a lenient position in the halachic area. And this student formulated a more stringent position from the text of the halacha, and he wanted the support of his rabbi, his teacher, to back him up in going against the local custom, which was to be lenient, to be mekel, and to support his chumrah that he came up with, that he established, that he came up with himself, that would this chumrah, this stringency against the local custom, which was to be mekel. And the Chasam Sofer disagrees with his student. He says, "No, don't be machmir. Don't be more stringent. The local custom is important, even to be mekel, and the local custom is an old tradition. It's gone on for centuries. And one of the things he comes up with later on in this long tshuva is Chadash Asur Min Hatorah. Your stringency, your chumrah is chadash. It's new, and we have to go against things that are new. So what's astounding about this is that the founding moment of this Chadash Asur Min Hatorah is not against reform. It's not against anything that's destroying tradition from an external source. It's actually from his own student who's trying to come up with a chumrah in halacha against the local custom, which is to be mekel, and therefore he defends the local custom, the kula, the leniency, and he says Chadash Asur Min Hatorah, don't bring in your chumrah, which is amazing. That's the source for it, and he uses it in quite a few other contexts as well, and then it gets a life of its own the idea how it becomes spread. Now, Chadash Asur Min Hatorah, when the Chasam Sofer uses it, could be substituted with the old Ashkenazic adage Minhag Yisrael Torah, any custom that the Jewish people use, which is a very Ashkenazi idea, an ancient Ashkenazi idea from medieval times, that it's binding. It's as if the Torah itself said it. And which the Chasam Sofer was very involved with upgrading as well, of upgrading custom and the importance of custom and not changing custom. That's another part of the legacy of the Chasam Sofer and how he used it to confront modernity. But the primary innovation of the Chasam Sofer was to use this idea of either, whatever you want to call it, Minhag Yisrael Torah or Chadash Asur Min Hatorah, whatever expression you prefer. Until the Chasam Sofer, it was used as a halachic mechanism within the rabbinic world of psak, which was common for centuries. Chasam Sofer goes ahead, and his innovation is to extend its use as a defense mechanism and almost like a weapon, confronting the challenges of modernity, confronting the onslaught against tradition. He brought it to its contemporary use, which is utilizing it as a tool in the face of this onslaught, in the face of this threat, perceived or real, the against tradition, against the halachic observance that he saw and understood as the correct way, which is very interesting. And what's even more interesting is because you'll notice that I used the word that he innovated, that it's a novelty. It's a new idea to use the expression of Chadash Asur Min Hatorah, and he himself says that he made it up. It was a novelty to use. Well, if it's a novelty, that means it's new. And if it's new, then it can't be used, because Chadash Asur Min Hatorah. So how did Chasam Sofer formulate the new expression of Chadash Asur Min Hatorah? If no one before the Chasam Sofer had thought of it, that means the Chasam Sofer was the first one to do it. If he was the first one to do it, then it's new. And you see where I'm getting with this circular logic. And obviously, it's a rhetorical question, but I'm trying to make a point. The point is that the Chasam Sofer was very aware that he was formulating a new expression. And here we can come to an interesting distinction that Moshe Kahana discusses, is that he calls it, a very cute way of referring to it, he calls it Chadash Asur, but Chidish Mutter. The Chasam Sofer was innovating, but he was always innovating, right? He wrote Chidushim his whole life. He was innovating within Torah, and the Chasam Sofer was incredibly creative. And he had this amazing mind, and he was a synthesis and creativity and innovation within Torah, this internal expression. Nothing was boring around the Chasam Sofer. Yiddishkeit was exciting. The Torah was exciting. There was always new. There was always something new. There was always chidushim. And that's what he was using to revitalize Jewish tradition. That was exactly the point. Chadash Asur is because one has to be aware of the limitations, of the boundaries that need to be created, of what's outside of tradition. And it could be referring to a student of his who's trying to implement a new stringency against the custom. It could even be used to a certain extent in his opposition to the Hasidic movement in Hungary, which he was opposed. He was a misnagid, which would be very surprising, because today most of the Hasidic world, especially from Hungary or Galicia, they look back at the Chasam Sofer as one of the greatest leaders, and that they're continuing his legacy, which is an interesting journey itself, the Oberland to Unterland journey. But in essence, in his own context, Chasam Sofer comes from Hungary. He's a Yeki. He's a German Jew. He's in Oberland. He definitely was Ashkenaz, not Hasidic at all himself, but even beyond that, he was a bit of an opponent to the Hasidic movement for the same thing, because it was novelty. It was new. They're going against the custom of the community. They're praying in a different nusach. They're doing things, Kabbalistic things. And even though he came himself from his primary Rebbe, Reb Nosson Adler, was ostracized by the Frankfurt community for innovation, for doing Kabbalistic formulas and stuff like that. And the Chasam Sofer sided with his teacher. He left Frankfurt in 1782 when he was 20 years old, never to return to his hometown. So he himself understood what a Hasidic type of innovation was, because Reb Nosson Adler was almost like that. But at the end of the day, when the Chasam Sofer is the establishment rabbi in Pressburg, and seeing the threats of modernity and confronting those challenges, he says, on the right, to the right of me, we have the Hasidic movement, which is innovating, and that can be dangerous also within the community. It's changing custom. It's new. It's different. And on to the left of me, we have the reformers. We have the Hamburg Temple. We have people like Aaron Churin, who was a student of the Noda B'Yehuda, who had become a reformer, who was a great one of the great antagonists of the Chasam Sofer. So he says, look, Chadash Asur Min Hatorah, we got to go keep with the established custom and the establishment what's been until now. And then the irony of the 3 decades of Chasam Sofer the primary activity. From he was the rabbi in Pressburg. He had smaller rabbinical positions earlier. He was the rabbi in Matzdar for nearly 8-9 years. He was the rabbi in Dresden. It's a smaller town. He had a yeshiva in each of those places as well. He was a teacher, and earlier in Presnitz and in other places. He had spent time in Vienna with his Rebbe Reb Nosson Adler when they were in exile. He even was a visit in Prague. He met the elderly Noida Yehuda, the previous great rabbi of the age. But in his main years of activity, the last 33 years of his life when he was in the Pressburg community, so one of the ironies of those 30-some-odd years was that he was leading the charge during a very unique time period where rabbinic modernity, rabbis who were innovating, who were changing tradition, who were implementing certain early changes using the rabbinic halachic process. In other words, they were writing tshuvas about how it's really permitted to do X, Y, and Z. And we can change the structure of the synagogue, and we can change the structure of prayer, and we can make certain halachic changes, and they would use the rabbinic halachic process to do so. And the Chasam Sofer's responses, which was polemics, to disprove them point by point, to restore the honor to the office of the rabbinate, to use all kinds of creative upgrades from D'Rabbanan to D'Oraisa and sanctifying custom and minig. Following the passing of the Chasam Sofer, the next generation of Central Europe, of Germany, of Hungary, those areas, that whole battlefield would become almost obsolete, because once assimilation kicks in, once secularization kicks in, then this idea of rabbinic, using the rabbinic process to implement the change, that inter-rabbinic polemics becomes a thing of the past, and it becomes obsolete. So the Chasam Sofer was at a very unique period in history where he sets the tone for the traditional community, which is why in many ways he's seen as the father of Orthodoxy, which Orthodoxy is like it's a modern movement. It's taking traditional Judaism and recasting it and using it in many defense mechanisms, confronting the challenges of modernity. And the Chasam Sofer is to a certain extent the father of that. One interesting example is that he discusses using milk from a non-Jew, which is prohibited. So he says if it's objectively prohibited, there's an objective prohibition at drinking milked by a non-Jew, then it's only a rabbinic prohibition. It's a light prohibition. But if it's objectively permitted, and the only reason to forbid it is because the custom of the Jewish community is to not partake in milked by a non-Jew, then all of a sudden it becomes a Torah prohibition. So if it's objectively permitted, it's a Isur D'Oraisa. If it's objectively forbidden, then it's only an Isur D'Rabbanan. That was the creativity of the Chasam Sofer. He talked very often in the last decade of his life about Atzmus Yisrael, about the idea that the Jewish community is as a community without their rabbis, because he saw rabbis in the last decade of his life, which is in his writings he's very pessimistic about the future because he sees the secularization. He sees the failure of the rabbinate. I mean, that's why he wanted his own students to become the rabbis, because he felt that would fix it. He sees that the rabbis are leading the charge. The people like Aaron Churin and people like others, the ones who made the Reform Temple in Hamburg, the main fights of his career. So he saw them as part of the problem. So he said, but the essence of the Jewish people, he says, if you can't even rely on the rabbi of your community because he's the one making the changes, so ask your mother what she did. What was the custom? What was the custom in your home? Go into your home to your Shabbos table and ask your grandparents what the right thing is to do. Go back to the source. And that's where his whole idea revolving around custom came as well. So there's a lot more to say about it. There's a lot of nuance here. There's a lot of context that's needed, and I've run out of time for this episode, and I'm kind of leaving it hanging in the middle because I jumped right into the Chadash Asur Min Hatorah idea. But I think in the next installment, we'll take a step back and actually trace the life itself of the Chasam Sofer, go through his biography, and especially his early years, his formative years, and how he ends up in Pressburg, and his relationship with the Pressburg community, which was filled with tension as well, and perhaps we'll explore that in the next couple of episodes. I'm looking forward to further installments of the Chasam Sofer series. This was Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.